Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm not Professor Gordon, and I'll be giving the lecture on Judaism, Christianity, and toleration. As we address this topic, I want to emphasize that we've been doing early modern Christianity up until this point, but as it says on the slide, and it seems a little obvious, Europe is a physical place, and it's big, and it's diverse. And to understand early modern Christianity and European history in general, we need to think about Europe in a more holistic way. And a lot of that is, what does it mean for all these people to live together? And what does this tell us about what themes are shared across groups and what are different? So hopefully we can have a richer and more nuanced understanding of what European history means. We're going to focus on this using Jews, one, because that's what I study, but also because there is a covenantal, spiritual, moral interaction between Christians and Jews, which is very important in Renaissance thought and in the Reformation more broadly. Both groups use the Old Testament, but what it means for each one is kind of different. But this biblical relationship will shape how Christians and Jews view each other and how they treated each other. And we're going to kind of take this narrative from where the Jews were to how Christians thought about them and what that means for their relationship and what we can learn about other groups. And Professor Gordon will talk about Islam in particular in the next lecture. One of the first things to think about with Jews in the early modern period is that they were on the move. And a lot of this was not voluntary migration, but forced due to a lot of expulsions that started in the late 15th century. And when I say a lot of expulsions, I mean a lot of expulsions. And the thing about this list, which you do not need to know in its entirety, is that this is a third of what I found when I was trying to make a list. So mostly I want to emphasize the scale, but there's one other thing I want to emphasize. One, the geographic range. You go from Eastern Europe to England, down to Italy. It is a continent-wide movement. The second thing I want to emphasize is that it's not really static. Some of these, as you can see in Bavaria or France, they end. Some don't end. Sometimes, as in Verona, it's really, really short. And sometimes it can start again. Prague is on there 3 times. And here's just a map to kind of show where Jews moved. From Spain, after the Alhambra decree in 1492, they really started to circle around the Mediterranean, going especially to the Ottoman Empire, where they were far more quote-unquote tolerated, and also going up to the Netherlands, which was a Spanish colony. It was under Spanish power at the time as the Spanish Netherlands. Jews that were in France and Germany tended to go east to Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. There weren't really Jews in Eastern Europe at the time, though now a lot of Jewish history in Europe focuses on Eastern European Jews, but this is when they became Eastern European Jews. One of the things about this movement that transformed Jewish life is it helped split the community into the kind of ethnic and cultural and religious groups that are still seen today, that helped centralize religious rites, traditions, and ethnicity. The major divisions being Ashkenazi and Sephardic. Sephardic Jews tended to be the Jews that were expelled from Spain. Sephardi is the root from Spain, Spanish Jews. And those were the ones that began to live around the Mediterranean and go up to the Netherlands. Ashkenazi Jews, who are the ones that went to Eastern Europe and began to have the Eastern European rites. Ashkenazi Jews are probably Jews that you know, because they make up 80% of the world's Jews at the right now, and migrated to America far more than Sephardi Jews did. One of the reasons these groups were able to coalesce and solidify was that Judaism is a closed community, a kahila, which describes a firmly bounded authority with very centralized lay and rabbinic leadership. And this leadership was able not only to clearly delineate boundaries within the community, but also to have fixed rules between Jews and Gentiles. Now, even though there was this centralization and inward looking, there was also, as Europe expanded with print and transportation, branching out. As Jews moved, there were new economic opportunities. Sephardi Jews became particularly involved in trade around the Mediterranean and in the Netherlands, while Jews in Germany and Lithuania became very involved as financial advisors, political advisors, and intermediaries in courts. Conveniently, they were called court Jews or Hauptjuden. With this transformation of Jewish life came major intellectual development. Just as the printing press probably caused or facilitated the Reformation, it also hugely transformed Jewish life. It allowed the codification of Jewish law, and the first major codification since probably Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, if not earlier. And the codification, the Shulchan Aruch, is still in effect today in many Hasidic communities. It literally means the table setting out the laws and the place, and the major commentary on it by Moses Isserles is called a hamapa, which means the tablecloth. Print also facilitated the development of a lot of mysticism and the codification of mysticism, which was formerly an oral tradition. And what we view as modern Kabbalah or modern mysticism, Lurianic Kabbalah, was formulated in this period. And there's far more information on the slides and in the PowerPoint than I can ever talk about. And with the rise of Kabbalah, you also see the rise of many mystical movements, such as Hasidism, which emphasizes internal piety, embodied practice, very akin to some of the spiritualist movements in Central Europe and Germany. The print also enabled some of the same trends that we saw in Galileo and the Reformation, the kind of ideas of rationalism, history, and science, which is often called the roots of the Jewish Enlightenment, the cosmopolitan Haskalah. So many of the themes that we saw in Christianity and in Christian Europe facilitated by better roads, cultural contacts through print, economic opportunities, reshuffling with nationality, both created inward-looking groups, but also had the same broad effects of spiritual religion, intellectual inquiry, and legal reform. It also allowed for the development of modern pop culture in Jewish life, specifically Yiddish literature and printing a lot of traditional folk songs. Here is a picture of a manuscript from 1751 of the song Chabad Yah, which is in Aramaic, but it has also been translated into many languages, including Yiddish and Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. It was first printed in the 16th century. However, the manuscript is falling apart, and I like this picture better. So here is what you can see. And it is a counting song. My father calls it the most annoying song in the world, as it is a counting song like there was an old lady who swallowed a fly. It has about 12 verses, and it gets faster and faster and faster. Essentially, the plot is Chad Gad Yah, one little goat, Dezaben aber bitre zuze, chad gadya, that my father bought for 2 zuzim. And then the goat gets eaten, and then the thing that eats the goat, which I believe is a lion, gets eaten. The story varies. You can see the traditional version is recorded there, as well as an English version recorded by Kung Fu Panda star Jack Black. Kind of the culmination of Jewish life and many of these threads in the period occurs in the story of Shabtai Zvi, or the false messiah, which took place in the mid-17th century. And if I was allowed, I would make this entire lecture about this man, as he had a fascinating life, but unfortunately, I can't do that. Shabtai Zvi and the Sabbatean movement that came with him was probably the largest popular movement in Judaism that ever happened. Just as the tumult, change, and expansion of knowledge expanded Jewish culture, it also was wildly destabilizing to both Jewish culture and to wider Europe. With expulsion and mass persecution, particularly in Christian religious wars, the Chelmniki massacre killed possibly up to 500,000 Jews, if not more, depending on who you ask and what your politics are. And then the changes in religious practice, specifically challenges to rabbinic authority and that Kabbalistic or Proto-Hasidic embodied religion, made fertile ground for political and radical movements. Enter Shabtai Zvi, a Turkish rabbi from Smyrna, who later moved to Safed, an intellectual center, and became very influential. He was influential because of his heterodox religious practice. Heterodox can mean anything from speaking and chanting to slapping rabbis in the face with fish, depending on what his mood was. Eventually, he proclaimed himself as the Jewish Messiah, and due to the fertile conditions of Jewry at the time, the Jews embraced him wildly, attracting mass attention from the Netherlands to Poland to Italy, and starting to worry many Christians as well. The story ended rather anticlimactically as the Ottoman Empire, where Shabtai Zvi was living and where Safed and Smyrna were, was starting to get very worried about all of these Jews organizing and stewing and getting angry and getting apocalyptic. And so they captured Shabtai Zvi and told him he had to either convert to Islam or be killed. He converted to Islam. This was not very popular with many of the rabbis, and they tried to erase every mention of it, and they were very good at it. So his legacy wasn't really known until the 20th century. But he and his religious practice had meant legacy not only in other faiths, but particularly in Hasidic Jewry. And there he is, sitting on his little throne, being approved by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, in glory. So I also want to pose the question, how Christian is the Reformation? And this is something that you might have been guessing about where I've been going, which is a lot of the developments of mobility, of knowledge expansion, of cultural exchange that facilitated the Reformation, facilitated change for everybody. And so I think it's very important to consider what was really unique about Christianity versus what can all groups benefit from, be that print, be that challenges to centralized authority and tradition like the rabbinate or the political structure, towards a more personal, almost mystical or textual experience. How does rationality, however you want to define that, or science or cosmopolitanism change how you approach nationality, your communal identity, and your religion? But I also want to emphasize that there are not necessarily common themes everywhere, particularly because Jews live in diaspora, which means there is no centralization. All of these developments were happening differently in different places, and there was no way that they could be enforced or challenged or changed beyond an individual community, with the exception of small cultural contacts. This was complicated because, in addition to being a diaspora, Jews can't own land. They were reliant on territorial princes for residential rights, including also civil rights and political rights like trading, marriage, holding public office, which limited what they were able to do and how they were able to enact change, which meant that if they wanted to enact change, it had to take a different path. This was also complicated by the narratives of persecution and expulsion, which led to a different idea of what a community was and what a history was and what a religion was, which meant that what was theology and what was a communal identity were not as clearly defined as doctrinal issues as they were in the Reformation. It was a lot fuzzier. Now I want to pivot to what Christians did with Jews. Christians really got interested in Jewish scholarship in this period, perhaps what could be called the beginning of biblical studies or Judaic studies. And it did involve contacts with real Jews. Jews in certain small communities, and particularly in Amsterdam, were really involved in producing this new Christian scholarship, working as translators, language instructors, printers' assistants, and there was collaboration. But there was also resentment, neutrality, hypocrisy. It was a tense and complicated relationship. But how many Jews were involved was limited, especially because, as we noted, the Jews moved to the east. They didn't stay in Western Europe, where a lot of the Protestant developments occurred, which meant that a lot of ideas that Christians had about Jews were based on the Old Testament. Jews as an old people, a religious device for Jesus. And there weren't real Jews to challenge them. Also, with the problems and the contradictions that Jews had by not accepting Christ, what Jews wrote and what Jews thought were heavily censored. The largest problem about this was law and gospel. How does the law of the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments and the ceremonial laws, relate to the idea of Jesus and Jesus' New Covenant and New Testament? And is that New Testament a replacement for the Old Testament? Or is there an important relationship of prophecy and moral lessons? And who, you ask, had very different opinions about this. And as Christians began to care more about the biblical text, they began to study Hebraic language, literature, and history to try and figure out what they should do with the Old Testament. This began with close language study. As we talked about way at the beginning, Erasmus and many other humanists emphasized studying texts in their original language in order to understand its pure, truish meaning. This was increasingly possible because the printing press allowed access to Hebrew texts and allowed people to synthesize manuscripts into a definite text for study. Printing began in the early 16th century, like a lot of printing began, but it really exploded in the 1510s and 1520s with the Venice printing industry headed by Daniel Bomberg, who was the first person to publish the Talmud, comprehensive rabbinic Bibles, many of which were and are some of the most expensive books on the market today. However, due to the papacy's changing opinions about Jewish study and the rise of things like the Index of Prohibited Books, the Italian Jewish printing industry eventually declined due to censorship and limitation, which led to an explosion of Protestant study and the transfer of printing centers of Hebrew books to places like Wittenberg and Amsterdam. And with that transfer came the expansion of Hebrew education, particularly in the 17th century when the first widely published grammars and dictionaries appeared. And to demonstrate the expansion of language study over the arching early modern period, here is a polyglot Bible in multiple languages, polyglot, that was printed in Spain as a tool for potential conversion and priestly education right at the beginning of the Spanish Inquisition, which included Hebrew, Latin, and Greek texts. It's called the Complutensian Polyglot after the university where it was produced. And it was a major achievement of printing, and it's very well done. It's a very good translation. By 100 years later, biblical scholarship may have spiraled wildly out of control. This is the London polyglot, or the Walton polyglot, which ran out of money in its production several times, and also shows the extent of how much quote-unquote Oriental linguistic scholarship had expanded. As you can see, it includes Arabic, Syriac, Aramaic Targum, Hebrew with Latin, Greek, and Ethiopic or Ge'ez. It's also wildly varying in accuracy. The point of including all of these languages was to show the complicated relations of Semitic and Middle Eastern culture in making the Bible, but it was also somewhat confusing. From this language study, Christian scholars were able to start to figure out more about what happened in the history of the Bible by understanding names, establishing precedents for what their own institutions, be those Catholic or Protestant, by claiming their origin. In books like the Magdeburg Centuries, Lutherans claimed that they were the pure church and tried to establish the foundational Lutheran beliefs which the Catholic Church had corrupted over time. It also allowed Christians to understand the relationship between their original sources, those patristic and biblical sources, with classical Greek and Roman accounts, and Jewish sources like Philo and Josephus, and try to weave together a history of antiquity. It also helped identify forgeries and move toward what many of you have probably studied, historical textual criticism, including debunking a lot of previously accepted mythical sources, like Hermes Trismegistus, who was sort of a Jewish, Egyptian, magician, saint thing, who was widely accepted as an authority up until the end of the 16th century. And as more history was learned, as more languages were learned, the Bible began to be analyzed in a different way. There was also an expansion in biblical anthropology, trying to understand what the Bible could tell us about all of the peoples of the world and what it meant socially. By anthropology, I mean study of peoples and cultures. Anthropology, as we understand it now, didn't really exist. And what we saw was studying contemporary Jews, but also studying contemporary Jews and their beliefs and practices to understand how that would relate to Christian doctrine, but also to apply their knowledge of minorities they ran into with new cultures they encountered in colonial and imperial projects. And this expanded with the publication of travel narratives, leading to something that I'll talk about in a second called the Jewish Indian theory. And here you can see a book which was published, the Synagoga Judaica, which was one of the first accounts of what the Jews were actually doing. in the early 17th century. So Christians began to learn more about what Jewish ritual was at that time and what that could mean. And then we have one of the most interesting things I've studied, which is this is only one of many books, but it's probably the most famous. Yale has 2 copies, called Jews in America, which was essentially a fundraising pamphlet for Protestant missionary efforts in America, but it also shows how a person, a pastor, Thomas Thorogood, could never leave Norfolk, but by reading travel literature, widely available Hebrew texts, could try and paint a theory of how the world was populated and what that would mean for the Christian agenda. And his idea was that Native Americans were one of the lost 12 tribes of Israel, and thus secretly Jews. Thus, because the apocalypse was coming, and the conversion of the Jews being a key sign of the apocalypse, it was imperative for the Puritans to convert the Native Americans in order to bring about the end of time. And so you should give him money. That was the essential plan. This was really influential at the time, though not without critics. But it shows the way all of this knowledge was eventually synthesized into what was even viewed in its own time as hack scholarship, as an internet or print conspiracy theory. So what does it mean for Christians to study Jews, for Jews to live in Europe and be persecuted or also interact with Christians, and for Christians to think about not only the people they study, but the people they live with? And this starts to lead to what we'll call a discourse of toleration. Now, what toleration actually means is up for debate based on who you ask. Like many things, it depends on who you ask. Some people felt that the people you tolerate are definitely wrong, but if you kill them or if you beat them with a stick too much, they're not going to convert and they're not going to help you. So being nice would help them convert more effectively. There were also some very practical ideas. Europe was tired. It had been devastated by war. Governments had changed. There were new economic needs. And being tolerant, particularly of other Christians, would allow for more peace. Tolerating Jews had also significant economic benefits, as Jews were often middlemen, brokers, bankers, and tradesmen. The common narrative about when toleration arose comes with the Enlightenment, some birth of rationality and inclusivity, which isn't not true, but as some of the ideas that we've talked about here show, it's a little more complicated. And what toleration and liberal rationality meant for even Enlightenment thinkers was up for debate. So, and this week you'll all read the letter on toleration from John Locke, and it shows that there were very Christian Enlightenment approaches to toleration, showing that to be a good Christian, you have to believe in the separation of church and state to live effectively, especially because the magistrate cannot save people's souls. While it was influenced by quote-unquote Enlightenment philosophy, it also had a distinct Christian bias. Then there were more radical approaches, like Baruch Spinoza, an ex-Jew who was excommunicated, who took a more broad approach, and also a much more controversial approach, that what God was didn't really matter for living together. It could be anything, and it wasn't really a matter of personal belief. But as long as people could figure out, as it says at the bottom, how to adapt their beliefs and adapt them to a practical understanding of other beliefs. It allows someone to act morally and to live together. This was often viewed as a denial of religion, or the validity of one religion, and it was wildly more controversial. And in addition to the various motives and various definitions of toleration, came challenges. How much toleration is okay? Does that mean we just don't kill people? Does that mean that our baseline is no more genocide? Or does it mean we really give people the right to practice their own religion? In public or private, there were many laws against building synagogues up until the 19th century or later. Does it mean they also get to be civil citizens? Are they going to get practical rights? If so, which ones? Full citizenship or just financial trading rights? Or are we going to go to pluralism, secularism, real private religion of all kinds? And which nation or which polity, nation is a complicated word, embraced which one was wildly varied, though most didn't take the last one of full secularism. Once you agree what toleration means, it also raises the question of for who? Other Protestants? Other Catholics? Catholics in general, if you're a Protestant? Jews? They believe in the Old Testament and they have the Old Testament, but they're not Christians. Muslims, who deny both Christianity and Judaism, and also have a large empire creeping up around Europe, right to the doors of Vienna. And what about traditional African or indigenous religions? Religions that originated completely outside of a European context. And as we go further across this list, who can be tolerated and what a religion and a race is start to mix together. There is an argument that Jews are the line. Jews share at least some characteristics of what it means to be a person, but ultimately reject some of the more idolatrous or quote, obviously blasphemic ideas, but not always. There's also the very real problem, specifically with the Jews, about Judaizing. If you study Hebrew and you learn Jewish history, are you going to corrupt the true meaning of the Bible? Are you going to deny Christ? Are you going to, by reading and learning about the Old Testament, denigrate Christian values? A lot of the criticism of the Catholic Church was that it had too much ceremony, too much participation in things that were similar to the ceremonial laws of the Old Testament, such as in Leviticus and Numbers. The Catholic Church was often called a synagogue of the damned. But the Catholic Church was also against the Jews putting the Talmud, the inanimate object of the Talmud, on trial and burning it publicly. So the intellectual ideas of how much Jew is too much Jew were live. There were also legacies of older, more folk, more violent anti-Semitism from the Middle Ages. And I'm not going to go into it in detail. This book, which is initially a post-war book by Rabbi Trachtenberg, is still one of the most read and used sources about medieval anti-Semitism and its modern implications. But in general, the folk belief was that the Jews killed Jesus and bear a lasting hatred towards all Christians, which leads them to kidnap generally Christian children and kill them and cannibalize them in often a perverted view of what Christianity is inverted ceremonies. This is often called the blood libel myth. And it persisted far longer than the early modern period. The last trial for blood libel that I can think of occurred in Russia in around 1900. So when we think about toleration and tolerations, there are also a couple things I want to emphasize, in addition to all the problems of living together that we've already talked about. First up is toleration is not a one-way street. It is not simply a political power granting rights to a minority that is helpless. Minority groups, such as the Jews in Verona, Livorno, and Italy, often advocated for religious freedom and trading rights. They were active participants in their own ideas of emancipation. Minorities, specifically Jews, often had to determine what they were willing to give up for political rights, for civil rights. For Jews, this often meant repositioning themselves solely as a religion, but otherwise not an ethnic group or a race or any other form of culture that would challenge Christian norms, often assimilating. And how much assimilation is still a very live issue, how much assimilation is acceptable, is still a very live issue in many Jewish communities today. Emancipation is also not comprehensive, as I think I suggested before. Not all rights were granted, and not all rights were granted at the same time. In Britain, the Toleration Act gave freedom of religion to English Protestants, but not to Catholics, non-Trinitarians, atheists, or Jews. Further, John Locke, even in his letter on toleration, implies that Catholics cannot be tolerated because they are loyal to a foreign power, i.e. France. And atheists cannot be tolerated because they do not believe in a God and thus can't uphold contracts, oaths, or other interactions needed for a political society to function. It's also important to emphasize that emancipation and toleration do not happen in a straight teleological line, and it's always reversible. The example I have up here is the Edict of Nantes, which gave toleration to Huguenots, French Protestants, and lasted for 100 years until it was revoked, and then eventually reinstated with the French Revolution, which granted freedom of religion to all Christians. There is an argument, which has attracted a variety of controversy, but which I agree with in secondary scholarship, that what toleration and emancipation and participation is can go very far. What the Holocaust was is perhaps the greatest referendum on toleration that has occurred. Jews were slowly stripped of rights completely legally until it was the right to life. Then, Jews gained more rights. But it is always reversible and it is never linear. And the consequences can be huge, both as I just suggested in modern day, but also as Jews existed in the early modern world, as the stories of expulsion, persecution, and dialogue with Christian sources suggest. And the ideas of living together don't go away and are complicated by similarities, differences, and perceived relationships based on imagined others or real people. And to end with, I also want to note that just as there were live issues, many of the things that started this whole problem about what the Old Testament is, what another person is, lasted through the French Revolution, that supposed moment of equality. Here's a picture of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which was generally viewed as this pinnacle of toleration and rationality. But as you can see, despite the Illuminati eye of pure truth floating above it, it's shaped like the Ten Commandments. There are angels. It is God-given rationality. And there's constant interaction. And not necessarily consistent or true resolution. That's all I have.